Today, I'm going to show you some more advanced concepts when it comes to routing in Next.js 14, show you some cool things that you can do with just the built-in Next.js router. Now, we're going to cover some fundamentals of dynamic routes, as well as intercepting routes, as well as parallel routes. And at the end of this, after we do just a conceptual overview here using the Next.js documentation here that you're seeing on the screen, once we kind of cover just a conceptual overview, we'll then move over to an example of just spinning up our own demonstration project in which I'm going to show you how to handle modals using a combination of dynamic routes, parallel routes, and intercepting routes. And if you can hear my dog in the background, that is because I owe him a walk, but I wanted to get this recorded for you guys first. So dynamic routes here in Next.js, and let me move my screen down here so you can see my URL. So I'm just at their documentation and then at the dynamic routes segment. So when it comes to dynamic routes, as it says here, when you don't know the exact segment names ahead of time and want to create routes for dynamic data, you use dynamic segments. So the convention for a dynamic segment is where you wrap a folder's name in square brackets. So it's going to look something like this. So in Next.js, you typically, when you want to create a new public route, you just create a new folder. So here you create a new folder called blog. So when the user accesses /blog, they would see what is returned or rendered in the page.js or JSX or TS file that is within the blog folder. So to create just a basic route, you would create a new folder, and let's say it's blog, and then to make that a public route to where a user can go to /blog and see a page, you would create a page.js or TS or JSX file within that blog folder. And whatever you return there is what they're going to see when they enter that page.js file. Now, if you want to create a dynamic route, you create a folder, so similar to what you do to create a normal route, but you put square brackets around the folder. And then once you put square brackets around the folder, as it says here, dynamic segments are passed a params prop, so you can use the data of that dynamic route. So for example, if you have a blog and you want to render out a different blog post for all of your different blogs. So if you go to blog/A, you would render your blog A. And if you go blog/B, you render blog B, so on and so forth. Well, you can do that with dynamic routes to where if they access blog/A, well, if you access params.slug and whatever you put within the square brackets here is going to be the property on your params object. So right here, they wrap slug in square brackets so they can access the dynamic value as params.slug. So if the user goes to blog/A, params.slug will evaluate to A. And if they navigate to blog/B, the slug property here will be the value of B. Now, if we used, instead of slug here, say we used ID, well, we would no longer pass params.slug, we would access params.id. And then params.id, if I went to /blog/12, it would be params.id would be equal to 12. So that is how kind of dynamic routes work in Next.js. You create them using square bracket notation, and then you're automatically passed a params prop to that page, and then you can access that dynamic value at params.slug, params.id, whatever you wrap in the square brackets is going to be the name on your params object that you can access to access that dynamic value. So, if it was an ID here and it was ID number 12, you could imagine that right here at the top of this function, I can make a GET request to the database to get blog number 12 and then render that content here. All right, so that's just a bit of a refresher on dynamic routes. I do have a full video to where I focus on that a bit more, but that will be at least somewhat important for this video. Now, what I would say is even more advanced is parallel routes. And at first, this might seem a little bit tricky, and it is a little bit tricky. I'm not going to lie to you. However, after kind of playing around with our tutorial that we're going to do, it's understandable. It's not, I might go over this overview and it might be like, Ryan, I have zero idea what you're talking about. And hey, I had no idea either when I first read this or when I was like first learning about some of these concepts. But once you play around on it, it will make more sense. I promise you that. So parallel routing allows you to simultaneously or conditionally render one or more pages in the same layout. For highly dynamic sections of an app, such as dashboards and feeds on social sites, parallel routing can be used to implement complex routing patterns. For example, you can simultaneously render the team and analytics page. So, in this example here, they have separate pages. So they might have a /team page as well as a /analytics page. But what if you want to render both of those pages like within your home page? So the user can like get a glance of all of their kind of team members as well as analytics all at the same homepage. Well, this is where you might use something like parallel routes. So you create a parallel route using the @ symbol here. So you can see it's @team and then @analytics. And then whatever you render within the page.js file of those @team and @analytics folders, that is what's going to show for these segments. So the way that you render these out within the same layout is that within the root layout page, so within this kind of app route segment here, so the root application, they want to show the analytics as well as the team page within kind of the root layout. So since they created this folder with @team and this folder with @analytics, they can now access those within their root layout here on the props object, and the property they can render is just going to correspond to the name of their folder. So if they want to render their props.children, so whatever is going to be in this page.js file, the root page.js file, if they want to render that, but they also want to render @team and @analytics in their root layout component here, they can render props.team and props.analytics. And then as this says down here, you can also create your own error and loading pages for these different parallel routes like you can for really any of your routes. So you can see how they kind of do this here, just adding in error and loading.js files within their @team folder and @analytics folder, and so on and so forth. And then down below, they talk a little bit more about kind of the convention behind it. So as I kind of explained earlier, parallel routes are created using named slots. Slots are defined with the @ and then folder name convention. So you prefix it with an @ sign and are passed to the same level layout as props. So just like I showed earlier, we create these with the @ sign, and then we need to pass it to this layout as props. So props.team matches team, props.analytics matches analytics. And then slots are not route segments and do not affect the URL structure. So, for example, if you had a folder called @team and then a folder within that folder called members, well, you would not access that at /@team/members. You would only access it at /members. So these parallel routes do not affect the URL structure. And then it says, for example, the following file structure defines two explicit slots, analytics and team. As you can see here, analytics and team. And then it says the folder structure above means that the component in app/layout.js now accepts the analytics and team props and can render them in parallel alongside the children prop. So in the root layout here, you can now render the props.team as well as the props.analytics. And it says the children prop is an explicit slot that does not need to be mapped to a folder. This means page.js is equivalent to app/@children/page.js. And then for unmatched routes, by default, the content rendered within a slot will match the current URL. In the case of an unmatched slot, the content that Next.js renders differs based on the routing technique and folder structure. So effectively, if you have an example to where, let's say you have at team and at analytics, but at team has a settings folder within it, and you go to /settings, well, your analytics folder here, it does not have a settings folder. So it doesn't really have a route to match /settings. So in this instance, you can render a default.js file, and that is going to say, okay, if we go to /settings and this analytics page doesn't have that, it's not going to have a matching route because there's not a settings folder within here, then render whatever they render in the default.js. So that can just, you can render null, or you could render, I don't know, anything else that kind of matches your use case there. So that's like a little bit of the gist on parallel routes, but hopefully it'll make more sense in our example. And then the last thing I want to cover is intercepting routes. So this is also a little bit of a more complex kind of routed digs, hence, the video advanced routing in Next.js, but intercepting routes. So intercepting routes allows you to load a route from another part of your application within the current layout. This routing paradigm can be useful when you want to display the content of a route without the user switching to a different context. For example, when clicking on a photo in a feed, which is the example that I'm going to show you in a sec, you can display the photo in a modal overlaying the feed. In this case, Next.js intercepts photo / and then some dynamic route. That's why we also went over dynamic routes earlier. And it masks the URL and overlays it over the / feed. When navigating to the photo by clicking a shareable URL or by refreshing the page, the entire photo should render in kind of isolation. So you can use this technique in which, let's say that you have this feed here, and then you want to click on a card and just show like a pop-up modal of a zoomed in card. Well, you can do that with intercepts to where they can click on this card and it's going to pop up this modal over here, and the URL, it is going to change to /photo /123. It's going to show the kind of photo page here as a modal. However, you're not going to lose the context of your feed. So you could still click out of this and just go right back to your feed. However, if you access /photo /123 in isolation, then it's just going to render out this photo without your feed. It's not going to pop up this modal, which is a very common feature that you might want. Now, the convention for this is intercepting routes can be defined with the parentheses ... convention, which is similar to relative path convention, but for segments. So you can use parentheses ... to match segments on the same level, ... to match segments one level above, parentheses ... parentheses ... to match two levels above, and so on and so forth. And 3 dots would be matching the root directory. So, for example, and I think this will make a ton more sense when we actually dive into the code a little bit, but say they have this feed here, and they kind of want to do what they showed in the example that we just went through earlier. If I wanted to, within my feed folder, be able to intercept my photo route so I could show like, that pop-up modal. Well, I could create a route intercept folder with parenthesis ... and it needs to match the path to this photo folder here, and then render out my modal for what I want to do there. So it's a little bit tricky, I know, but just know that the parenthesis ... convention is based on route segments, not the file system. So you basically can intercept a route to show some different content without having to like actually navigate within your app and change context. So with all that said, let's head over to VS Code here. And what we're going to do is create just a demo application to show you what I'm talking about here. So let's do npx create next app at latest. And I believe it's going to be Next.js 14 something. I'm recording this actually in December, like in the middle of December right now. Kind of pretty close to Christmas. I'm just trying to get ahead on videos a little bit so I can, just go home for the holidays and kind of veg out. But I'm going to name this advanced routing. And I realize I just named it router, but that's going to be fine. Not going to use TypeScript, no ESLint. We are going to use Tailwind. This is not going to focus on styles much, but I will just apply some styles with Tailwind. And then no SRC. We are going to use the app router. We're not going to customize the default import alias. So this is going to create this project, and then I'm going to go File, Open, and then open this within VS Code. So we are now here within VS Code, and in my app folder here, let's first just go to my page.js file, and I'm going to rename this to JSX here. And this is basically where we're going to render out a feed. And then the goal of this app is when they click on a photo in the feed, they're going to see a pop-up modal. However, if they go to that URL by itself, it's just going to go to a photos page that shows that photo in isolation without the modal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove everything here. So just remove everything. So you're just rendering this out, and we are going to first render, and I will link this project in my description so you can copy and paste the styles. But let's first start with a main tag. And within that, we're going to do an H1 that just says feed. And then below that, we're just going to do a div. And then below this div, this is where we are going to map over our photos and render out our feed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create within our public folder, I'm going to create a photos folder. So new folder, photos within public. And then I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to just call this photos.js. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just grab some photos. And one thing to note is that I am also basing this off of this Next.js application. So I want to give credit to this GitHub as well. I'm just kind of, simplifying this a little bit for what I thought was a little bit easier to understand. But this is largely based off of, what Next.js shows here. Ours is going to look different than this for sure. But we are going to use some photos that they show in this application. So yeah, if you want to look further into this demo, this is also a really good resource here. But for our purposes, I'm going to copy and paste the photos that I already have here. So just copy and paste this const photos, which is an array, into this file, and go check out my finished project so you can see these photos as well. And so you can use them. Now, if any of these photos are broken for you, then you could, pretty easily just replace the image SRC with a different photo source that you want to use, or that that works, or something like that as well. But I think these photos should still be all good for you for the most part, at least to learn what we're talking about here. So now that we have those, we're going to import these at the top of this file. So I'm going to import photos from at public/photos/photos. And then within this div here, what we're going to do is open up curly braces to enter JavaScript land. And then I'm going to do photos.map. And then we are going to destructure the ID in the image src from each photo. And then we are going to return a link from Next.js. So I'm going to import link from next link. And then I'm going to make sure to actually add the arrow bracket. And then the key is going to be equal to the photo ID. And then the href, this is going to equal a JavaScript template string. So curly braces, backticks, and then this is going to link to /photos $$ curly brace ID. So it's going to link to the ID of the photo, and we are eventually within our feed here, we are going to intercept this /photos $ID with a route intercept and actually show a modal. And we're going to use parallel routes to actually do that. So within this link, we are going to render an image, which we already had imported at the top. And then I'm going to close this image as well. But for the alt, caps lock sod for the alt, I don't know. I'm going to just say maybe backticks, image, and then $ curly brace ID. I don't know. That might not be the best alt, but we're not really focused on that right now. SRC is going to be the image SRC, and then height, we're going to just set this to 500. Option shift down arrow, we're going to set the width to 500 as well. And then that should be all I want to do for this feed. Now, I'm also going to add some styles here that I'm going to just copy and paste from my GitHub. So now that we kind of have the structure in place, go ahead, go to my GitHub, and in my root page.jsx file, feel free to just copy and paste the styles that I'm going to do here as well. So I copied them and I will paste them in right here, but everything else should be the same apart from the styles here. And I think I use a different alt here, but that's also not super important. So other than that, that should set up our homepage pretty well. Now, I think if we just render out, so if I run npm run dev here, we should be able to go to localhost 3000 and see this application. So let's go ahead and do that now. And as you can see here, I get this invalid src prop. I've run into this error before. If you've watched my tutorials, you've seen me run into this error before. We need to add to our Next.js config, we need to add our remote patterns. So within your next config object, add an images property. Within your images property, make that an object. And then within that object, add a remote patterns property. Make that an array. And then add an object in which we set a protocol to equal the string HTTPS. And then the host name is going to be our URL src, which is going to be pbs.twimg.com. And that's going to match our photos, our base URL right here. So we just need to add that so Next.js could render our images. And if I refresh this, we do indeed see some images here. So the goal is we can click on these images. We see a pop-up of the image and it intercepts our route and shows our different pages in parallel. So let's come back to VS Code and let's go ahead now and let's add the route intercept. So within my app folder, let's add a new folder and it's going to be photos. I don't know what the heck I was typing there, but this is going to be a dynamic route. And then within photos here, and this is actually not going to be our intercept. This is just going to be adding a dynamic route so they can access app/photos/some photo ID. And then within photos, we're going to create a new folder. It's going to be square bracket, ID, square bracket. So a dynamic route. And then within the ID folder, we're at a new file, page.jsx. All right. So you can see in my breadcrumbs here, I'm at app, photos, ID, page.jsx. And then within this component here, we're going to import our photos here as well. So import photos from at public/photos/photos. And then we are also going to do export default function photo page. And then as I showed in the example earlier, since this is a dynamic route, it's going to automatically accept a params property on the props object. So params. And then since we named it square brackets ID, we're going to access params.id. We can actually just do nested destructuring here. So I'm going to do colon square brackets ID. So we're going to destructure ID right out of the gates. All we need to do here is say const photo, the photo we want to use, is equal to photos.find, and then call that function, pass in, I'll just do a p, and I'll say p.id is equal to the ID. So we are getting the photo with the matching ID of our params segment here. So if they go to /ID number 2, let's say, then it's going to access the photo that has the ID of number 2. And you can imagine this basically could be like a database request as well. If you had photos stored in like, I don't know, some S3 bucket or something like that, this is where you can make a request and you could generate static props and stuff like that. But for the sake of this, we're just getting this ID from this dynamic route, and then we want to return our photo. So I'm going to return, and it's going to be a div, and then a div within a div. And then here, we're going to create a photo component where we just pass the photo as a prop and then close that. So let's go create this photo component. So within our app, I'm going to create a components folder. And then within our components folder, I'm going to just create a photo.jsx file. And then all we're going to do here is export a default function called photo. It's going to accept the photo prop, and it's just going to return, well, it's going to return a React fragment here in which it's going to return an image that we're going to import from next image. The alt, I don't know. That could be just like photo.id. And then the src, that is going to be photo.image src. Let's do a height. Let's switch it up. 600, option shift down arrow. Let's do a width, 600 as well. And then I'm also going to add a class name here that I'm going to copy and paste from my GitHub, and you can do the same, or you can just, pause this right now and fill this in. And then under this, we're going to do a div that has an h3 that is going to be the photo dot name. And then below the h3, we're going to do a paragraph, open up curly braces, and this is going to be photo dot user name. So we're going to show the name of the photo as well as the username of the photo. So we're going to show the name as well as their username to give them credit. And then to this div, I'm going to add some classes as well. So right here, I'm going to add background white, P4, pixels 6, and then text black. So now let's go back to our photos ID. And now let's render this photo component from components/photo. And then I am also going to copy and paste some class names in here as well. And you can, of course, do the same, but the structure didn't change. We just added some class names in here. So yours should also look like this. So now we should currently within our app, if I click on a photo, it should navigate me to /. So let me click photos /1. And we see our photo page here. And the way that this occurred is because in our feed, we wrap all of our images with this link, and it links to /photos /some ID, the photo ID. And we capture that here at /photos this ID. So say this ID is number 1 here. It's going to link us to /photos /1. We're going to get the params to where the params.id is going to be equal to number 1, which we are going to get the photo with the ID of number 1. And we're just going to show that on this page here. So we are effectively having these dynamic routes here that are linking to our different photos. Now, the only other functionality we want to add here is now, instead of doing this when they click on a photo, we actually just want to show a modal, because we want to still show the context of the feed behind the modal. But if they then decide to access this URL by themselves, then they should just see this page. So we can do this using parallel routes as well as intercepts. So I think everything up until this point has been pretty straightforward. This is where it might get a little more tricky. So to create this parallel route within our app folder, we're going to create an @modal folder. Make sure this is a folder. And then within our app @modal folder, what I want you to do is create another new folder. And then within @modal, it's going to be parenthesis, because we're matching the same layout here or the same directory. So within our app, we want to intercept our photos *ID route. So since we're at the same level, it's just going to be a dot. And then the rest of this is going to match the route that we want to intercept. So it's going to be photos /ID *. So this is saying within this root layout here, we want to, and let me move that out. We want to intercept the photos *ID route. Just to also be clear here, based on how I set that up. So I, within this, created a new folder here called *photos. And then it created another folder, *ID *. I just kind of did that all in one when I was naming this. So if I click rename, this just looks like standalone photos here. And then this, if I click rename, you're going to see this is just *ID. Okay, so if I now within my ID page, I'm going to create a page.jsx file. So you can see I am app is my root folder, and then I'm at an @modal folder, and then I have my *photos route intercept folder, and then I have another nested folder at *ID and then a page.jsx file within that ID page. And this is going to work very similar to our previous page, but this time around, we want to render out a modal component rather than just rendering out the page. All right, so when we're in our feed here, this should intercept that link navigation and show this modal. So what we're going to do is let's import our photos here once again. And then below this, we're going to export a default function photo modal, which we're going to accept our params just like we did in our dynamic route. And then we're going to go :ID to destructure our ID from our params. And then we're going to say, same thing as we did earlier. We're going to say const photo is equal to photos.find. I'm going to pass in p and then say p.id is equal to ID. And then below this, we're going to return. I'm going to create a modal component, and we're going to render a photo component within the modal, in which here I'm going to pass in a prop where photo is equal to photo. So now within our components folder, let's create a new file called modal.jsx. And all this is going to be is a modal here. Now, there is a decent amount going on in this component, so bear with me a little bit. It's not crazy, but it is going to be a client component because we're going to be handling like page clicks and stuff like that. But then we're going to do export a default function modal. It's an accepted children prop. And then we're going to say const overlay is equal to useref, initialize that to null, and then do option shift down arrow. Instead of overlay, it's going to be wrapper, initialize that to null. Now I'm going to say const router is equal to use router, import that from next navigation, and make sure you call that function. And then we're going to create a function const on dismiss is equal to use callback. If you're not familiar with how use callback works, I do have React videos on this exact function. But I'm going to say router.back to make this basically use the back button in the browser. And I'm going to set the router as my dependency here, because I am just trying to be a little bit careful on when I'm initializing this on dismiss function so I don't cause any issues. I'm going to do the same thing for this. So I'm going to do const on click is equal to use callback. And then I'm going to call this function. It's going to accept an event. And then what it's going to do is use some logic to where I'm going to say if event.target is equal to overlay dot.current, or event.target is equal to wrapper.current. And then what we want to do is say if there's an on dismiss function, then we want to call the on dismiss function. So if they click outside of our modal, then dismiss the modal is effectively what this logic is saying here. And then we want to set the on dismiss as a dependency to this, which since we're setting the on dismiss to a dependency of this, it's also important that we make on dismiss a callback so it's not getting reinitialized all the time. And then we're also going to create a const on key down is equal to use callback. And then we're going to pass this a function that accepts an event, and then say if event.key equals escape, then call our on dismiss function. So if they hit the escape key press, then close our modal, and then pass in on dismiss here as a dependency. And then also I need to pass our overlay as well as our wrapper as dependencies to our on click there as well. And I think that should set those functions all up here. And then the very last piece of logic we want to do here is have a use effect, as in an inline function here. And then within our use effect, what we want to say is document dot add event listener. And then what do we want to listen for? Well, that is going to be the key down event. Function do we want to call? Our on key down function. And then we need to make sure return a function to clean up here. So we do document dot remove event listener. What's our event listener called? Key down. What's our function called? Well, it's going to be the on key down function. And then we want to run this, or our dependency is going to be our on key down function. And since we're using functions in all of our dependencies, we really want to make sure to be careful of only initializing those when we absolutely need to. And then here below, we're going to return a div where the ref is going to be equal to our overlay ref. And then we're going to set an on click is equal to our on click function. And then within that div, and let's also move these to separate lines here. And I'm also going to add a class name to this div as well that you can, of course, copy and paste. Let's add another div. And I'm going to add a ref is equal to our wrapper. And then let me make sure I spelled wrapper right up here, right? Yes, I did. So that's going to be our wrapper. And then I'm going to add another class name to this div here. And then all we need to do is render out within this div our children. So I know that was quite a bit, but hopefully it's pretty straightforward still though. Like we're basically just handling like if they click outside of the modal, close the modal. If they hit the escape button, close the modal is basically what we said with that logic there. All right, let me clean this up just a little bit. And with that in place, I think that's everything we need because we already set up our dynamic route here as well as our feed. But now when they click on within our homepage, our root page.js, when they click on a photo, it should navigate to / this dynamic route, but this should get intercepted here by our modal. And one thing I forgot, which hopefully you caught, is we still need to render our parallel route within our layout.js. So we want to render our children, but not only do we want to render our children, but we also want to render out our modal. So let me grab modal and render that out below our children here. So then when they get navigated, we should intercept this and render our modal. But if we go to this URL on its own, it should just render this page. So let's come back, refresh for good measure, click on the first image, and I get an application error. And one issue I notice here is I actually didn't import use ref from React. And within my photo modal, I see I don't have modal imported in this component whatsoever. And then after getting those imports set up, what I also needed to get in place was within our @modal parallel route, I needed to add a default.jsx file to that route and just return null. And now when I go back and I test things out, I click on this photo, I see this modal, click on this photo, I see this modal, and you see it's intercepting these routes here, doing all that accordingly. But then if I just go to, let me copy this URL, let me click out of it, and then I'll just paste that URL, it accesses this photo separately. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how intercepts and modals and dynamic routes work. I'll make sure to push this project up. I already have a project pushed up because I created this project before to show you this tutorial. So there might be like a slight different project name to it. Let me actually, my project will be at CodeRyanSolomon /advanced routing. So if anything kind of went wrong there, you should be able to go into this project and see exactly how I have everything set up here. And everything should be pretty much a one-to-one to what we did. So, just consult this if you're running into any issues. You could even clone this repo and then start it and make sure that, everything looks kind of like what you want. So yeah, with that, hopefully that you found that helpful, and I will see you in that next one.